The gavel froze mid-air above the auctioneer's block, its shadow falling across Grace Whitfield's face like a death sentence. Her 6-year-old daughter Emma pressed closer against her worn calico dress, tiny fingers clutching at fabric that had seen too many washings and too few meals. "Do I hear $50 for the Morrison Ranch and all its holdings?" Jeremiah Thornfield's voice cut through the suffocating Texas heat like a blade through bone. This wasn't supposed to happen. Thomas had promised her the ranch was free and clear, that their little piece of heaven would always be Emma's birthright. A woman in the crowd gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as the reality struck home. They were witnessing a widow and child being stripped of everything. The courthouse steps creaked ominously under the weight of vultures disguised as neighbors, their hungry eyes calculating profit margins against human suffering. Grace's wedding ring caught the merciless sunlight, a golden reminder of promises that death had rendered worthless. 8 months ago, she'd been a rancher's beloved wife. Today, she stood one bid away from destitution. Going once. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each thundering hoofbeat that shattered the morning silence. Who was riding toward them with such desperate urgency? And would they arrive in time to change everything? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Grace Whitfield had been a different woman entirely. She'd stood in her kitchen at sunrise, flour dusting her apron as she prepared Thomas's favorite biscuits, humming an old hymn her mother had taught her. The morning light had streamed through gingham curtains she'd sewn herself, illuminating a life built on simple dreams and honest work. Back then, her biggest worry had been whether the spring calves would be strong enough for market, not whether she and Emma would have a roof over their heads come winter. Grace had once been Miss Grace Henderson, the schoolmarm of Harmony Creek, with plans to attend the Teachers' College in Austin. She'd possessed a trunk full of books and a head full of dreams about educating the children of Texas. But then Thomas Whitfield had walked into her classroom one autumn day to discuss his younger brother's education, his hat in his hands and his heart in his eyes, and suddenly college seemed less important than the way he said her name like it was a prayer. Now, at 28, she bore little resemblance to that optimistic young teacher. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned in the latest fashion, hung in a simple braid down her back. Her hands, once soft from handling nothing heavier than chalk and books, were calloused from milking cows and mending fences. The wedding dress she'd worn 8 years ago hung in their bedroom closet, too fine for ranch work and too painful to look at since Thomas's funeral. Emma Rose was the light that kept Grace anchored to hope. At 6 years old, she possessed an uncanny ability to read the emotions of adults around her, offering comfort with the wisdom of someone far beyond her years. Her cornflower blue eyes seemed to hold secrets that even she didn't understand, and there were moments when Grace caught her staring off into the distance as if remembering something just beyond her grasp. Their ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of rolling Texas hill country, where ancient oak trees provided blessed shade from the relentless sun. Thomas had chosen this land carefully, drawn to its natural springs and fertile valleys. The main house, built from native limestone, stood solid and welcoming with its wide front porch and hand-carved railings. Thomas had spent 3 years building it himself, working evenings and weekends until every board and stone reflected his love for his family. But love, Grace had learned, couldn't pay debts that materialized like ghosts in the night. The mysterious fever that claimed Thomas last October had come without warning. One day he'd been his usual strong self, planning improvements for the spring. The next, he lay burning with illness that Dr. Morrison couldn't identify or treat. Within a week, the man who'd never been sick a day in his life was gone, leaving behind a widow who discovered that security was as fragile as morning dew. Now, drought threatened the remaining cattle, creditors circled like buzzards, And Grace faced the terrible reality that love and determination might not be enough to save her daughter's future. The knock that changed everything came at dawn on a Tuesday, sharp and insistent against the kitchen door where Grace was kneading bread for the day ahead. Emma sat at the wooden table, carefully practicing her letters on a slate, her tongue poking out in concentration. The sound made them both freeze. Visitors at sunrise rarely brought good news to ranch families. Jeremiah Thornfield stood on her porch like a well-dressed harbinger of doom, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as a man who'd never worked with his hands. His pale gray eyes swept over Grace's flour-dusted apron and Emma's curious face peering around her mother's skirts, calculating their vulnerability with the precision of a predator. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, removing his hat with false courtesy, "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate business to discuss regarding your late husband's financial obligations." Grace felt her world tilt sideways. "I beg your pardon. Thomas paid his debts. We lived modestly, saved every penny we could." Thornfield produced a leather portfolio from his coat, extracting documents with an air of regretful authority. "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate, ma'am. Your husband borrowed considerable sums to stock this ranch, loans that have been accumulating interest for several years now." The papers swam before Grace's eyes as she tried to make sense of the figures. $2,000. It might as well have been $2 million for all the possibility she had of raising such a sum. "These documents. I've never seen them before. Thomas would have told me about debts this substantial." "Men often shield their wives from financial burdens," Thornfield replied smoothly, his tone suggesting that Grace's ignorance was perfectly natural for someone of her gender. "Unfortunately, death doesn't eliminate obligations. The estate must settle all debts before any assets can be transferred." Emma tugged at Grace's skirt, sensing the tension without understanding its source. "Mama, why is the man making you sad?" Grace lifted her daughter, drawing strength from Emma's warm weight against her hip. "It's nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, her mind raced through their meager assets. The ranch was their only valuable possession, and without it, they would have nothing. "I'm prepared to be reasonable," Thornfield continued, consulting his gold pocket watch, as if her family's destruction were merely an appointment in his busy schedule. "I'll give you 72 hours to arrange payment. If you cannot meet the obligation, we'll be forced to auction the property to satisfy the debt." 72 hours. Grace felt the walls of her carefully built life crashing down around her. "Mr. Thornfield, surely there must be some mistake." "Some way to verify these claims." His smile was thin and cold. "I'm afraid the original documentation was damaged in a fire at the bank last month. These copies are all that remain, but they're legally binding nonetheless." He tucked the papers back into his portfolio with practiced efficiency. "I suggest you use the time to explore your options. Perhaps family members who might assist, or friends willing to help in your hour of need." As his buggy disappeared down the dusty road, Grace sank into Thomas's old rocking chair on the porch, Emma still in her arms. Family. Her parents had died of influenza 3 years ago, taking with them any hope of financial support. Friends. The other ranch families were struggling just as hard as she was, fighting drought and falling cattle prices. That afternoon, she walked to the neighboring spread where Eula Mae Hutchins had lived alone for 40 years, ever since her husband died in a cattle stampede. The elderly woman met her at the gate, her weathered face creasing with concern as Grace explained her situation. "Child," Eula Mae said, settling heavily into her porch swing, "I've seen enough wolves in sheep's clothing to spot one from Sunday. That Thornfield boy has been circling struggling families like a buzzard for years now, always showing up with mysterious debts right after someone dies. Grace felt a flicker of hope. You think the documents are fraudulent? Can't prove nothing, Eula May admitted, her faded blue eyes distant with memory. But I can tell you this. That boy's been carrying poison in his heart since he lost his own son to fever 10 years back. Couldn't afford the medicine that might have saved the child, and it twisted something inside him. Now he seems to think money's the answer to every problem, even if he has to steal it from widows and orphans. The old woman's words offered little comfort but confirmed Grace's instincts. Something felt wrong about Thornfield's sudden appearance, his convenient timing, his damaged documents. But instincts wouldn't save her ranch and suspicions wouldn't feed her daughter. That evening, as Emma slept peacefully in her small bed, Grace sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's account books spread before her, searching desperately for any record of the loans Thornfield claimed. She found meticulous records of every penny spent and saved, but nothing that suggested the crushing debt that now threatened to destroy them. Outside, the Texas wind rattled the windows like the approach of an unwelcome future. The mysterious rider materialized from the dust cloud like something out of a fever dream, his horse lathered with sweat and foam from what must have been a punishing ride across the Texas plains. Grace felt her breath catch as the stranger dismounted with fluid grace despite his obvious exhaustion, his weathered face shadowed beneath the brim of a black hat that had seen better years. $1,000, came his voice, steady and clear as a church bell, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Every head turned toward him as if pulled by invisible strings. Grace found herself staring at a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from honest work rather than soft living. His dark brown hair showed premature streaks of silver at the temples, and when he removed his hat, she caught a glimpse of eyes so startlingly blue they reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. Thornfield's face flushed red as a turkey's wattle. "Sir, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. This is a legal proceeding, not a charity auction." "Name's Caleb Ashford," the stranger replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. He reached into his saddlebags with deliberate movements, producing a leather pouch that clinked heavily with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. "I've got the money right here. 1,000 in gold should more than cover any legitimate debts." Grace felt her knees go weak with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. Who was this man, and why would he spend a fortune to save strangers? In her experience, such generosity always came with strings attached, and she'd learned to be wary of gifts that seemed too good to be true. Emma pressed closer against her mother's side, her small hand finding Grace's fingers and squeezing tight. The child's intuitive understanding of adult emotions had always amazed Grace, and now she could feel her daughter's confusion mixing with cautious hope. Thornfield's calculating mind was clearly working overtime, his pale eyes darting between Caleb's confident stance and the pouch of gold that represented his own thwarted plans. "Well, actually, with accumulated interest and penalties, the total debt comes to $1,500, he announced, his voice taking on the oily tone of a snake preparing to strike. Without hesitation, Caleb added more coins to the growing pile on the auctioneer's table. $1,500 it is, then, plus another $200 for any additional complications that might arise. His tone made it clear that he understood exactly what kind of man he was dealing with and wasn't impressed. For the first time since stepping onto the courthouse steps that morning, Grace allowed herself to meet the stranger's gaze directly. What she saw there, a mixture of determination, kindness, and something that looked almost like recognition, stirred emotions she'd thought died with Thomas. There was something familiar about the shape of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, but she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Going once?" Thornfield called reluctantly, his dreams of acquiring prime ranch land for pennies on the dollar crumbling before his eyes like sandcastles before an incoming tide. "Going twice," the auctioneer continued, clearly uncomfortable with the dramatic turn of events. "Sold to Mr. Ashford," came the final pronouncement as the gavel fell with a sound like thunder. The crowd began to disperse, many muttering amongst themselves about the mysterious stranger who had appeared like an answer to prayer. Grace remained frozen on the courthouse steps, Emma's small hand still clutched in hers, as Caleb approached them with the careful movements of a man approaching a spooked horse. "Ma'am," he said softly, replacing his hat with a gesture that spoke of careful upbringing, "I know this must be confusing, but I need you to trust me. We need to talk, but not here where every word will be tomorrow's gossip." His words carried an undertone of urgency that made Grace's pulse quicken with equal measures of hope and fear. The ride back to the ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of wagon wheels and Emma's occasional questions that neither adult seemed prepared to answer. Caleb had secured a wagon from the livery stable, insisting with quiet authority that the ladies shouldn't have to walk in the blazing heat. Grace found herself studying him covertly as he handled the reins with the easy competence of a man born to ranch life, noting details that both comforted and unsettled her. His hands were calloused in the exact pattern of someone who'd spent years working cattle and horses. His posture in the driver's seat spoke of countless hours in the saddle. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to know the way to her ranch without directions, taking turns and shortcuts that even some long-time neighbors might miss. "Mama," Emma whispered, tugging at Grace's sleeve, "why does Mr. Ashford have eyes like mine?" The innocent observation hit Grace like a physical blow. Now that Emma had pointed it out, the resemblance was unmistakable, the same cornflower blue shade, the same distinctive shape, even the same way of looking directly at people as if seeing straight through to their souls. Grace's hand instinctively moved to her throat, where her pulse hammered against her collar. When they finally reached the ranch, Grace felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched Caleb's reaction to seeing her home for the first time. His expression shifted through what looked like surprise, recognition, and something that might have been grief, before settling into careful neutrality. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, his voice carrying an odd note of reverence. "Thomas always did have an eye for good land." Grace stopped walking so abruptly that Emma bumped into her. "You knew my husband?" Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We served together during the war." "I knew him before he settled here." The explanation felt incomplete, like a door that had been opened just wide enough to glimpse the room beyond before being firmly shut again. Grace led them onto the front porch, where Thomas's rocking chair still sat exactly where he'd left it on that last morning 8 months ago. She'd never been able to bring herself to move it, as if maintaining his spaces might somehow bring him back. Emma immediately claimed Caleb's attention, chattering about her cat patches and the new calf that had been born just last week. Grace watched in fascination as the weathered cowboy transformed in the presence of her daughter, his stern features softening into genuine warmth as he listened to her stories with the focused attention usually reserved for important business matters. "Uncle Caleb," Emma announced with the casual confidence of childhood, "would you like to see my room? Mama let me paint flowers on the walls." "Emma," Grace protested, "Mr. Ashford isn't—" "I'd be honored to see your artwork, Miss Emma," Caleb interrupted gently, earning a brilliant smile from the little girl. As Emma dragged her new friend toward the house, Grace followed slowly, noting how naturally he seemed to fit into their domestic routine. He admired Emma's painted flowers with genuine enthusiasm, complimented the smoothness of the wooden floors Thomas had installed, and accepted a glass of cool water from the well as if he belonged at their kitchen table. But it was when Emma brought out her collection of carved wooden animals that Grace saw Caleb's carefully maintained composure crack. His hands trembled slightly as he examined a small horse that Thomas had made for Emma's 5th birthday, running his fingers over the smooth wood with reverent care. "Your father was very skilled," he told Emma, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "This is beautiful workmanship." "Daddy made it special for me," Emma replied proudly. "He said every little girl should have a horse to carry her dreams." She paused, studying Caleb's face with unsettling intensity. "You look sad when you touch it. Did you know my daddy really well?" Grace felt her breath catch. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent lifetimes trying to hide. She watched Caleb struggle with how much to reveal to a 6-year-old, his internal battle playing out across his weathered features. "I knew him when we were both young men," Caleb said finally, "before either of us understood how precious family really was." That evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed with stories and prayers, Grace and Caleb sat on the front porch as the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The silence between them felt charged with unspoken questions and half-revealed truths. "You saved us today," Grace said finally, her voice barely audible over the evening sounds of cattle settling for the night. "I need to understand why." "And no one spends that kind of money on strangers without expecting something in return." Caleb was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something valuable. "Thomas wrote to me before he died. A letter I received 3 months too late because I'd been moving around, never staying anywhere long enough for mail to catch up." He pulled a worn envelope from his shirt pocket, its edges soft with handling. "He told me about you and Emma, about how much he loved you both, about wanting to make sure you'd be taken care of if anything happened to him." Grace's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. "He never mentioned writing to anyone. I thought we were completely alone in the world." "Thomas was trying to protect you from complications he couldn't fully explain," Caleb continued. "Our history together was difficult. Family relationships that got tangled up with war and guilt and decisions made by boys who thought they were men." The weight of his words suggested depths of story that Grace sensed she wasn't ready to hear. Instead, she focused on the practical implications of his presence. "What happens now? The ranch is yours legally, even if you bought it for our benefit. Emma and I have no claim to it." Caleb turned to face her directly, his blue eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "The ranch belongs to you and Emma. It always has. I just made sure that vulture Thornfield couldn't steal it out from under you with his fraudulent papers. You think the debt was fake?" "I know it was," Caleb replied grimly. "I've spent the last week investigating Thornfield's business practices. He's been running the same scheme across 3 counties, targeting widow families with mysterious debts that appear right after the breadwinner dies. Always backed up by documents that are conveniently damaged or lost in fires." Grace felt a cold fury building in her chest. "You mean he's done this to other families?" "At least a dozen that I've been able to identify. Probably more. He's systematic about it. Waits for a tragedy to strike, then swoops in like a buzzard to pick the bones clean." Caleb's voice carried a hardness that spoke of personal investment in seeing justice done. "But he made a mistake when he targeted you and Emma." "What kind of mistake?" Caleb's smile was grim and predatory. "He went after family, and that's something I take very personally." The next morning brought Sheriff Benjamin Hayes to their door, his badge gleaming in the early sunlight and his expression troubled. Grace had known Ben since childhood. He'd courted her briefly before Thomas arrived in Harmony Creek, and their relationship had settled into comfortable friendship after her marriage. "Grace," he he said, removing his hat as he stepped onto the porch where she and Caleb were sharing morning coffee. "I heard about yesterday's excitement at the courthouse. Thought I should check on you and Emma." His eyes moved to Caleb with the professional assessment of a lawman encountering an unknown quantity. "Mr. Ashford, isn't it mighty generous of you to help out a widow and her child?" There was something in Ben's tone that suggested his visit wasn't entirely social. Grace felt tension crackling between the two men like lightning before a summer storm, though she couldn't identify its source. "Just doing what needed to be done, Sheriff," Caleb replied evenly. "Seemed like Mrs. Whitfield was getting a raw deal from that banker." Ben's weathered face darkened. "Funny thing about Jeremiah Thornfield, he's been making some interesting claims about you in town. Says you might not be exactly who you claim to be." Grace felt her stomach drop. "What kind of claims?" "Nothing specific yet," Ben admitted, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. "But he seems to think your benefactor here might have his own reasons for taking such a sudden interest in the Whitfield ranch." Caleb stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. "And what do you think, Sheriff?" "I think," Ben said carefully, "that a smart man would be cautious about accepting help from strangers, especially when those strangers have deep pockets and mysterious pasts." The confrontation was interrupted by Emma bursting through the front door, her face flushed with excitement. "Uncle Caleb! The new calf got loose from the pen, and Mama says you might know how to catch him without scaring the mama cow." The child's innocent interruption diffused the tension momentarily, but Grace could see that nothing had been resolved. As Ben prepared to leave, he caught Grace's arm gently. "Be careful, Grace," he said quietly. "I know you're grateful, and rightfully so. But gratitude can sometimes cloud judgment. If you need anything at all, you know where to find me." After the sheriff departed, Grace found herself studying Caleb with new eyes. Who was this man who seemed to know more about her husband and her ranch than he was willing to admit? Why had Thornfield's accusations struck such a nerve with both men? And most troubling of all, why did Emma seem to trust him with the instant, absolute faith usually reserved for family? That afternoon, while Emma napped in the heat of the day, Grace discovered Caleb in Thomas's workshop, examining the tools with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. He looked up guiltily when she appeared in the doorway, as if he'd been caught trespassing. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I should have asked permission before." "It's fine," Grace interrupted, though she wasn't entirely sure it was. "You seem to know your way around a workshop." Caleb set down the plane he'd been examining, his expression growing distant. "Thomas was always good with his hands. Even as a boy, he could fix anything that was broken, build anything you could imagine." The past tense, the familiar tone, the way he spoke as if he'd known Thomas intimately, it all added up to questions Grace wasn't sure she wanted answered. But Emma's future depended on understanding who this man really was and what he truly wanted from them. "Caleb," she said softly, "I think it's time you told me the truth about how you knew my husband." The truth, when it finally came, shattered Grace's world more completely than Thornfield's fraudulent debts ever could. Caleb stood in Thomas's workshop, surrounded by tools that bore the loving wear of skilled hands, and spoke words that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her life. "Thomas Whitfield was my younger brother," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of regret. "My name isn't Caleb Ashford, it's Caleb Whitfield, and I'm the man who abandoned his family when they needed him most." Grace felt the walls of the workshop spinning around her. She gripped the edge of Thomas's workbench, her knuckles white against the smooth wood he'd spent hours perfecting. "That's impossible. Thomas said his entire family died in an Apache raid when he was 16. He said he was the only survivor." "That's what he believed," Caleb replied, his blue eyes, Emma's eyes, Thomas's eyes, filled with anguish. That's what I let him believe because I was 18 years old and drowning in guilt, and I thought it would be easier for him to start fresh without the weight of what happened. The workshop seemed to shrink around them as Grace struggled to process this revelation. Every story Thomas had told her about his childhood, every sad reference to his lost family, every lonely moment when he'd spoken of being the sole survivor, all of it based on a lie told by the brother standing before her now. "Tell me what really happened," she whispered, though part of her feared the answer. Caleb moved to the workshop's single window, staring out at the land Thomas had loved so dearly. "We lived on a small spread about 50 miles north of here. Our parents, Thomas, me, and our little sister Mary. I was supposed to be there that day, the day the raiders came. I was supposed to be protecting my family." His voice cracked on the last word, revealing pain that 15 years hadn't managed to heal. But I'd ridden out early that morning to hunt, determined to prove I was a better provider than our father. I wanted to show everyone that I was the man of the family, even though I was barely more than a boy myself. Grace found herself holding her breath, dreading the next part of the story but needing to hear it all. "I came back to find everything burning," Caleb continued. "Our parents were dead. Mary was dead. And Thomas was unconscious, badly injured but alive. I managed to get him to the nearest settlement, but he was delirious with fever for days. When he finally came around, he kept asking about the family." "And you told him they were all dead?" Grace said, the pieces clicking into horrible place. "I told him everyone was dead, including me." Caleb's shoulders sagged under the weight of his confession. "I convinced the preacher's family to tell him that Caleb Whitfield had died of his injuries. I thought, God help me. I thought if he believed I was gone too, he could start fresh somewhere else, make a new life without the burden of what happened, without the burden of having a brother who'd failed to protect his family." The workshop fell silent, except for the sound of Grace's ragged breathing. She thought of all the times Thomas had spoken wistfully of his lost brother, the way he'd named their daughter Sarah after his deceased sister, the plans he'd made to name their son Caleb if they'd ever been blessed with one. He'd carried love for his dead family his entire life, never knowing that his beloved brother was alive and torturing himself with guilt. "He grieved for you," Grace said finally, her voice barely audible. "Every day of his life, he grieved for the brother he'd lost. He used to say that if he ever had a son, he'd name him Caleb, after the bravest person he'd ever known." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. He pressed his forehead against the window glass, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was giving him a chance at happiness without the weight of my failures. Instead, you gave him a lifetime of loneliness," Grace said, surprised by the harshness in her own voice. "You let him believe he was completely alone in the world when he had family who loved him." Before Caleb could respond, the workshop door burst open and Emma appeared, her face flushed from her afternoon nap and her hair tousled with sleep. "Mama? Uncle Caleb? Why are you both crying?" Grace quickly wiped her eyes, forcing a smile for her daughter's sake. "We're just talking about your daddy, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they remember people they love." Emma studied them both with the unnerving perceptiveness that seemed to be her birthright. "Uncle Caleb, did you love my daddy too?" The simple question from an innocent child broke something inside Caleb. He knelt down to Emma's level, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, little one. I loved your daddy very much. More than I think I realized until it was too late to tell him." Emma considered this gravely, then threw her small arms around Caleb's neck in a fierce hug. "That's okay. Daddy knows now. Mama says people in heaven can see into our hearts, so he knows you loved him." Over Emma's head, Grace watched Caleb's face crumple with grief and gratitude. The sight of this weathered, strong man being comforted by a 6-year-old child stirred emotions in Grace that she wasn't prepared to examine. Despite her anger at his deception, despite the pain his choices had caused Thomas, she found herself moved by his obvious love for Emma and his genuine remorse for the past. That evening, after Emma had been put to bed with extra stories and cuddles, Grace and Caleb sat on the front porch in heavy silence. The Texas stars glittered overhead like scattered diamonds, and the night air carried the peaceful sounds of cattle settling and night birds calling. It was the kind of evening Thomas had loved best, when the work was done and family could simply be together. "I have more to tell you," Caleb said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "About why I really came here, and about the danger I might have brought to your door." Grace felt her stomach tighten with fresh dread. "What kind of danger?" Caleb reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a telegram, its edges worn from repeated handling. "This came 3 days ago." "3? Someone's been asking questions about me in Austin, making inquiries about my real identity and my connection to this area." Grace took the telegram with trembling hands, squinting to read it by the dim light spilling from the kitchen window. The message was brief but ominous. Questions being asked about C. Whitfield. Suggest you disappear again. Friends becoming enemies. Watch your back. "I don't understand," Grace said, though a cold fear was beginning to form in her chest. Who would be asking questions? And why would it matter now after all these years? Caleb's expression was grim. "Because I'm not just Thomas's brother, Grace. I'm also the heir to a considerable fortune that I've been running from for 15 years. My grandfather left money, a lot of money, in trust for his grandsons. When I disappeared and was presumed dead, Thomas became the sole heir. When he died, the inheritance would go to Emma," Grace finished, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "But if you're alive, then I'm the rightful heir, and Emma loses everything that should have been her father's legacy." Caleb ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "I never wanted the money. That's part of why I disappeared in the first place. I couldn't stand the thought of profiting from my family's deaths. But someone's figured out who I am, and they're not content to let sleeping dogs lie." The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form in Grace's mind. "Thornfield," she said suddenly. "He didn't target us randomly, did he? He knew about the inheritance somehow." Caleb nodded grimly. "I think he's been planning this for months, maybe years. Create a debt large enough to force the sale of the ranch, buy it for pennies on the dollar, then somehow use it as leverage to claim the inheritance on Emma's behalf, with himself as her guardian, of course." Grace felt sick. The scope of Thornfield's scheme was breathtaking in its cruelty and ambition. He hadn't just been trying to steal their land, he'd been positioning himself to steal Emma's entire future. "But now you're here," she said slowly, "and his plan has fallen apart." "Now I'm here," Caleb agreed, "and I've painted a target on all of us. Because if I die, the inheritance goes to Emma. And a 6-year-old child is much easier to control than a grown man who's spent 15 years learning to defend himself." The night suddenly felt colder, full of shadows and unseen threats. Grace looked toward the house where Emma slept peacefully, blissfully unaware that her very existence had made her a target for men who saw dollar signs where others saw a precious child. "What do we do?" Grace asked, though she dreaded the answer. Caleb's voice was quiet but filled with deadly determination. "We protect Emma. We expose Thornfield's schemes. And we make sure that little girl gets the safe, happy childhood that Thomas wanted her to have, even if I have to die to ensure it." The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud, and Grace realized that their troubles were far from over. In fact, they might just be beginning. The crisis erupted 3 days later when Emma collapsed during her morning chores, her small body burning with fever that seemed to consume her from within. Grace found her daughter crumpled beside the chicken coop, the scattered feed forming golden pools around her unconscious form like fallen sunshine. "Emma! Oh, God! Emma!" Grace's scream brought Caleb running from the barn, his face going white as he saw the child's lifeless stillness. He scooped Emma into his arms, her body frighteningly light and hot against his chest. "We need Dr. Morrison, now." The ride to town became a nightmare of dust and desperation, with Grace holding her burning daughter in the back of the wagon, while Caleb pushed the horses harder than he'd ever pushed any animal. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, her blue eyes glassy and unfocused when they occasionally fluttered open. "Mama," she whispered during one brief moment of lucidity, her voice barely audible over the thundering hoofbeats. "I dreamed about Daddy. He said not to be scared." Grace's tears fell onto Emma's fevered face as she stroked her daughter's damp hair. "Daddy's watching over you, sweetheart. He won't let anything happen to his little girl." Dr. Morrison's examination confirmed Grace's worst fears. "It's scarlet fever," the elderly physician announced grimly, his weathered hands gentle as he checked Emma's pulse. "Seen 3 cases this month already. It's running through the county like wildfire." "Can you treat it?" Caleb demanded, his knuckles white as he gripped his hat. The doctor's hesitation spoke volumes. "There's a new medicine, diphtheria antitoxin, that's shown promise with scarlet fever cases, but it's expensive and I'd need to send to Austin for it immediately." "How expensive?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer would be beyond their means. $50, Dr. Morrison replied quietly, plus the cost of the urgent telegram and express shipping. "Call it $75 total." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. $75 might as well have been $75,000. Even with the ranch saved from Thornfield's auction, they had no liquid assets, no ready cash for medical emergencies. Caleb was already reaching for his wallet. "Send the telegram now. Whatever it costs, send it." "Caleb, no," Grace protested. "You've already done too much. I can't let you." "She's my family too," he interrupted, his voice brooking no argument. "Thomas would never forgive me if I let his daughter die for want of money." But as Dr. Morrison prepared to send the urgent telegram, Sheriff Hayes arrived with news that turned their medical crisis into something far more sinister. His face was grim as he approached Caleb on the doctor's front porch. "Mr. Ashford, or should I say Mr. Whitfield, I have a warrant for your arrest." Grace felt the world tilt sideways. "Ben, what are you talking about?" The sheriff's expression was pained but determined. "Jeremiah Thornfield has filed charges of fraud and identity theft. Claims this man has been impersonating a dead person to gain access to property that rightfully belongs to Emma Whitfield's estate." Caleb's laugh was bitter. "Impersonating myself? That's a new one, even for Thornfield." "The problem is," Hayes continued reluctantly, "he's produced documentation showing that Caleb Whitfield died 15 years ago. Death certificate, burial records, witness statements. As far as the law is concerned, you're either a fraud or a ghost." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. By maintaining his false death for so many years, Caleb had given Thornfield the perfect weapon to use against him. If he admitted to being alive, he validated 15 years of fraud. If he maintained his false identity, he could be arrested for impersonation. "Ben, you can't arrest him now," Grace pleaded. "Emma is dying. She needs that medicine, and Caleb's the only one who can afford it." Hayes's weathered face creased with genuine anguish. "Grace, I'm sorry. I truly am. But I have to follow the law. The warrant's valid, and Thornfield's got Judge Patterson backing his play." As the handcuffs clicked into place around Caleb's wrists, Grace felt her daughter's future slipping away like water through her fingers. The medicine that could save Emma's life was beyond her reach, and the one man who could afford it was being dragged away in chains. "I'll post bail," Caleb called over his shoulder as Hayes led him toward the jail. "Send that telegram, Doc. Get the medicine. I'll find a way to pay for it." But Grace knew that Thornfield wouldn't allow bail to be posted easily. The banker had orchestrated this timing perfectly, ensuring that Emma's medical crisis coincided with Caleb's legal troubles. Even if Caleb could arrange bail, it might take days that Emma didn't have. That evening, as Grace sat beside her daughter's hospital bed in Dr. Morrison's makeshift infirmary, Eula May Hutchins appeared in the doorway like an answer to desperate prayer. The elderly woman's face was etched with determination and something that looked like righteous fury. "Child," Eula May said without preamble, "it's time you knew the truth about that snake Jeremiah Thornfield. He's my son, and I've kept quiet about his crimes long enough." Grace looked up from Emma's fevered face, hardly daring to hope. "Your son? Born 32 years ago, spoiled rotten from the day he drew breath," Eula May continued, settling heavily into the room's single chair. "Lost his own boy to scarlet fever 10 years back. Same disease that's got your Emma now. Could have saved the child if he'd swallowed his pride and let Doc Morrison treat the boy for free, but Jeremiah was too proud to accept charity." The old woman's voice cracked with remembered pain. "Watched his son die rather than admit he couldn't afford the medicine. Something broke inside him that day, twisted him into thinking money was the only thing that mattered in this world." Grace felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "So he's been stealing from other families, convincing himself it's justified?" "Been planning this scheme for months," Eula May confirmed. "Heard him talking to those lawyers from Austin about the Whitfield inheritance. Figured if he could control Emma through fraudulent debts, he could eventually claim guardianship and manage her money." The revelation was devastating in its implications. Thornfield hadn't just been stealing land, he'd been positioning himself to steal Emma's entire future, using the death of his own son to justify destroying other families. "But I've got proof," Eula May continued, producing a worn leather satchel from beneath her shawl. "Jeremiah always was careless with his papers when he thought nobody was watching. Account books showing his real financial position, correspondence with corrupt officials, even a draft of forged documents with his handwriting all over them." Grace stared at the satchel as if it contained gold bullion. "This could free Caleb and expose Thornfield's entire operation." "More than that," Eula May said grimly. "It could send my son to prison where he belongs and compensate every family he's cheated over the years." As Emma stirred restlessly in her fevered sleep, Grace realized that their darkest hour might also be the moment when truth finally conquered deception. But first, they had to get this evidence to Sheriff Hayes before Thornfield realized his own mother had turned against him. Time was running out for Emma, and their enemies were closing in from all sides. The confrontation that would change everything erupted at dawn on the 4th day of Emma's illness, when Jeremiah Thornfield arrived at the Morrison Ranch with 3 armed men and a fury that burned hotter than the Texas sun. Grace stood on her front porch, Emma finally resting peacefully inside after the antitoxin had broken her fever during the night, watching as evil incarnate stepped down from his expensive carriage. "Mrs. Whitfield?" Thornfield called, his voice carrying the false courtesy that barely concealed his rage. "I've come to discuss the unfortunate situation regarding the man you've been harboring on your property." Grace lifted her chin with the pride that 6 generations of strong women had bred into her bones. "If you mean Caleb Whitfield, he's family, and family is always welcome on this ranch." Thornfield's pale eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear woman. You see, I've been doing some very thorough research into your mysterious benefactor's background, and what I've discovered would shock you to your very core. Behind him, his hired gunmen spread out in a practiced formation that spoke of violence barely held in check. Grace recognized the type, men who sold their consciences for gold and asked no questions about the blood that might stain their wages. Caleb Whitfield died 15 years ago, Thornfield continued, pulling a sheaf of documents from his coat with theatrical flourish. Death certificate, burial records, witness statements, all properly notarized and legally binding, which means the man who's been living under your roof is either a supernatural entity or a common criminal who's stolen a dead man's identity. Grace felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "And what business is that of yours, Mr. Thornfield?" "It becomes my business when fraud is committed against the rightful heirs of the Whitfield estate," he replied smoothly. "You see, when Caleb Whitfield died, his inheritance passed to his younger brother Thomas. And when Thomas died, it should have passed to his daughter Emma, with a proper guardian appointed to manage her affairs, of course." The pieces of his scheme crystallized with terrifying clarity. Thornfield hadn't just been after their ranch. He'd been positioning himself to become Emma's legal guardian, giving him control over an inheritance worth more than Grace could imagine. "I'm proposing a simple solution," Thornfield continued, his voice taking on the oily tone of a snake preparing to strike. "You surrender this impostor to the proper authorities, accept my guardianship of young Emma, and I'll ensure you're provided for as befits the mother of my ward. Refuse, and I'll be forced to take more direct action." The threat was unmistakable. Grace's eyes moved to the armed men flanking Thornfield, calculating her chances of reaching the rifle Thomas had always kept just inside the front door. Not good, especially with Emma recovering inside and unable to flee if violence erupted. "I see you're beginning to understand your position," Thornfield said with satisfaction. "Where is the impostor now? Still locked up in Hayes's jail, I presume?" "That's where you're wrong, you pompous snake." The voice came from behind the barn, where Caleb stepped into view with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent years learning to move silently when necessary. Sheriff Hayes emerged beside him, his badge catching the morning sunlight and his expression grim with purpose. Grace felt her heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. Caleb was free, but he was also walking into what looked like a death trap. Thornfield's face went white, then flushed purple with rage. "Hayes, I gave you explicit orders to keep that man locked up." "Funny thing about orders," the sheriff replied calmly. "They have to come from someone with actual authority, and as it turns out, you don't have quite as much influence as you thought." From behind the house came another voice that made Thornfield stumble backward as if he'd seen a ghost. "Hello, son." Eula May Hutchins walked around the corner with the dignity of a queen going to her coronation, her weathered hands steady as she carried the leather satchel that contained 15 years of her son's crimes, documented in his own handwriting. "Mama?" Thornfield's voice cracked like a 13-year-old boy's. "What are you doing here?" "I'm doing what I should have done 10 years ago when you started down this path," Eula May replied, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's love corrupted by necessity. "I'm stopping you before you destroy any more innocent families the way you destroyed your own." The old woman opened the satchel and began pulling out documents, spreading them on the porch railing like evidence in a court of law. Forged loan papers, correspondence with corrupt officials, account books showing where you've hidden the money stolen from dozens of families. It's all here, Jeremiah. Every crime, every lie, every family you've destroyed in the name of the grandson you let die because your pride was worth more than his life. Thornfield's composure cracked completely. "He was my son. Everything I did was to honor his memory." "You dishonored his memory the moment you decided that stealing from other children was somehow justified by losing your own," Eula May shot back. "That beautiful boy would be ashamed of what you've become, and you know it." One of Thornfield's hired guns shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his weapon. Sheriff Hayes was ready for him, his own Colt appearing in his hand with practiced speed. "I wouldn't," Hayes said quietly. "This county doesn't take kindly to men who draw on women and children." But Thornfield was beyond reason now, his carefully constructed facade crumbling to reveal the broken man beneath. "You don't understand. None of you understand. I had everything, a son, a future, a legacy. And it was all stolen from me by poverty and pride and circumstances beyond my control." His voice rose to a shriek that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. "If I have to steal and cheat and murder to get back what was taken from me, then so be it. At least I'll have something to show for 30 years of pain." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Grace watched in fascination and horror as 15 years of guilt and grief poured out of Jeremiah Thornfield in a torrent of self-justification and rage. "Murder?" Sheriff Hayes stepped closer, his weapon still trained on the hired guns. "Are you confessing to Thomas Whitfield's death?" Thornfield's laugh was the sound of sanity shattering. "Thomas was going to discover my plans. Found him going through bank records, asking questions about estate procedures. I couldn't let him ruin everything, not when I was so close to securing Emma's inheritance." Grace felt the world spinning around her as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "You poisoned him. You murdered my husband." "I gave him what he deserved for interfering in affairs beyond his understanding," Thornfield snarled. "Just like I'll give all of you what you deserve for standing in the way of justice." The violence that followed happened so quickly that Grace barely had time to process it. Thornfield grabbed for one of his gunman's weapons, Sheriff Hayes shouted a warning, and suddenly the peaceful morning air was filled with gunshots and screaming. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Thornfield's hired guns lay dead in the dust, the third was clutching a wounded arm and begging for mercy, and Jeremiah Thornfield himself sat in the dirt with blood seeping from a shoulder wound that would heal with time and proper care. "Justice," Sheriff Hayes said grimly, holstering his smoking weapon, "is finally served." But it was Eula May who delivered the final judgment, standing over her wounded son with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I loved you, Jeremiah, loved you more than life itself. But I loved that sweet grandson of mine too, and he deserved better than to have his memory twisted into an excuse for evil." As Hayes began organizing the arrest of the surviving criminals, Grace rushed inside to check on Emma, her heart pounding with the realization that their ordeal was finally over. She found her daughter sitting up in bed, her fever broken and her blue eyes bright with curiosity. "Mama," Emma said with the matter-of-fact tone that only children could manage, "why was everyone shouting outside, and where's Uncle Caleb?" Through the window, Grace could see Caleb helping Sheriff Hayes secure the prisoners, his movements confident and purposeful. The man who had lived in shadows for 15 years was finally stepping back into the light, ready to claim his place in their family. "Uncle Caleb is right where he belongs, sweetheart," Grace said, gathering her daughter into a fierce hug. "Right here with us, where he'll always belong." 6 months later, the courthouse in Harmony Creek buzzed with excitement that had nothing to do with foreclosures or fraudulent auctions. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating white ribbons and wildflower arrangements that transformed the stern chamber of justice into something approaching a chapel. Grace Whitfield stood at the threshold in her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, watching as the entire community gathered to witness the union that had grown from tragedy into something beautiful and true. Emma Rose practically vibrated with excitement in her role as flower girl, her cornflower blue dress, sewn by Eula May's loving hands, swishing around her ankles as she scattered rose petals with the focused concentration of someone performing the most important job in the world. Her recovery from scarlet fever had been complete, leaving no trace of the illness except for the deeper bond it had forged between her and the man she now called Papa without hesitation. "You ready for this, child?" Eula May whispered, adjusting Grace's simple veil with fingers that trembled only slightly with age and emotion. The elderly woman had thrown herself into wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost celebrations, her joy unmarred by the fact that her own son now resided in the state penitentiary. Grace nodded, her eyes finding Caleb at the front of the room where he stood beside Judge Patterson, the same judge who had signed his arrest warrant months ago, now officiating his wedding with genuine pleasure. Caleb had traded his worn work clothes for a simple black suit that emphasized the silver streaks in his dark hair and the strength in his shoulders. When their eyes met across the crowded room, his smile held all the warmth that 15 years of self-imposed exile had tried to freeze. Dr. Morrison played a simple melody on Mrs. Caldwell's borrowed piano, his weathered fingers finding the keys with surprising grace. The town had embraced this wedding with the fervor of a community that had witnessed too much sorrow and was hungry for joy. Every pew was filled with neighbors who had watched Grace struggle through widowhood and had rejoiced in her unexpected second chance at happiness. Sheriff Hayes sat in the front row, his presence a testament to the healing that had occurred in the aftermath of Thornfield's crimes. His initial suspicion of Caleb had transformed into genuine respect and friendship, especially after the investigation had revealed the scope of the banker's fraudulent schemes across 3 counties. "Dearly beloved," Judge Patterson began, his voice carrying the authority of law tempered by the warmth of genuine affection, "we gather today not just to witness the union of 2 hearts, but to celebrate the triumph of truth over deception, love over fear, and family bonds that transcend even death itself." Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to the judge's words. This wedding was more than a celebration of her love for Caleb. It was a declaration that their unconventional family had not just survived their trials, but emerged stronger for having endured them together. The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, spoken not with the desperate passion of youth, but with the deep certainty of adults who had learned that love was not just feeling but choice, renewed daily through both joy and hardship. "I, Caleb Whitfield, take you, Grace, to be my beloved wife," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the emotion that roughened its edges. "I promise to love and cherish you, to stand beside you through whatever storms may come, and to never again let fear or guilt separate me from the family that God has blessed me with." Grace's response came from the deepest places of her heart. "I, Grace Whitfield, take you, Caleb, to be my beloved husband. I promise to trust in the love we've found, to build our future on the foundation of truth we fought so hard to establish, and to honor the memory of Thomas by living fully in the happiness he would want for us." When Judge Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, the courtroom erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Emma threw herself into Caleb's arms with a squeal of delight, her childish joy infectious enough to bring smiles to even the most stoic faces in the crowd. The reception, held on the grounds of the Morrison Ranch under oak trees that Thomas had planted years earlier, felt like a homecoming celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes brought by every family in the county, and lanterns strung between branches cast a golden glow over festivities that continued well into the night. Eula May held court at one table, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of Emma's precocious wisdom and Caleb's transformation from haunted wanderer to devoted family man. "That child," she declared, gesturing toward Emma as she danced with Dr. Morrison, "has more sense in her little finger than most adults manage in a lifetime. Knew from the first day that her Uncle Caleb belonged here, even when the grown-ups were too stubborn to see it. As the evening wound down and neighbors began the journey back to their own homes, Grace found herself standing with Caleb on the front porch where this entire adventure had begun. Emma had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled up in the rocking chair with her head in Grace's lap, her small hand still clutching the ribbon from her flower bouquet. "Thomas would be proud," Caleb said quietly, his arm encircling Grace's waist as they looked out over land that was now legally and truly theirs. "Of Emma, of you, of the family we've managed to build from the pieces of what was lost." Grace leaned into his warmth, feeling the deep contentment that came from knowing her daughter was safe, her future secure, and her heart complete. "I think he's been watching over us all along. There were too many miracles, too many perfect timing coincidences for it to be mere chance." Above them, the Texas stars glittered with the same brilliance they'd shone on Thomas's last night on Earth, on the day Caleb had ridden out of the dust to save them, and on every day since when their unlikely family had grown stronger through trial and triumph. Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like Papa's home, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that they all were exactly where they belonged. The Morrison-Whitfield Ranch would thrive in the years to come, its prosperity built not just on good land and hard work, but on the unshakable foundation of love that had proven stronger than deception, more enduring than loss, and more precious than any fortune that gold could buy. In the end, they had found their way to happiness not by avoiding pain, but by walking through it together, hand in hand, toward the light waiting on the other side. Dear friends, Grace and Caleb's story reminds us that life's greatest treasures often emerge from our deepest trials. At 55, 65, or beyond, many of us carry the weight of lost dreams, family secrets, and roads not taken. Just like Caleb, who spent 15 years believing his guilt disqualified him from love and belonging. Grace discovered that a woman's strength isn't measured by avoiding heartbreak, but by choosing to trust again after betrayal. Their journey teaches us that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up, staying present, and loving unconditionally through both sunshine and storms. Emma's innocent wisdom that grown-ups keep secrets that hurt people challenges us to examine our own hearts. What burdens are we carrying that could be transformed by truth and forgiveness? Like Eula May, who chose justice over enabling her own son, sometimes love requires the courage to do what's right rather than what's comfortable. Grace and Caleb found their second chapter when they stopped running from their past and started building their future together. Their happiness came not from perfection, but from persistence. The daily choice to love despite fear, trust despite disappointment, and hope despite heartbreak. Share your thoughts. What family secret or past regret have you been carrying that might be holding you back from happiness? How has your definition of family evolved as you've grown older? Leave a comment below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.